I am Dr. Ted Barnett, President and founder of Rochester Lifestyle Medicine Institute, and I'm so excited to be able to welcome Dr. T. Colin Campbell tonight, who will be talking about why is nutrition not taught or respected in the medical system. Dr. Campbell will be giving a presentation till about 8:30 or so about an hour, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A, and Dr. Campbell has graciously agreed to stay around for as long as necessary to get all of your questions answered. And let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Colin Campbell before we turn it over to him. So Dr. T. Colin Campbell is the Jacob Gould Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University. He's dedicated to the science of human health for more than 60 years. He specializes in nutrition and cancer and related diseases and is founder and board president of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. Dr. Campbell was an undergraduate at Penn State, where he received his BS, a graduate student at Cornell University, where he received his MS and PhD, and a postdoctoral research associate at MIT. He was then a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition at Virginia Tech from 1965 through 1975, and in the Cornell Division of Nutritional Sciences from 1975 to the present. He's a recipient of several Lifetime Achievement Awards, including from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, the Plantation Project, and the American Institute for Cancer Research. He has published over 350 professional publications, mostly peer-reviewed. He has also published the China study, which has sold over 3 million copies and has come out in 50 foreign language translations. Another well-known book of his is called Whole, which was a New York Times bestseller. Also, he's written The Low Carb Fraud and the Future of Nutrition. He has delivered more than 1,300 lectures in the US and abroad, and tonight is number 1,301. So, Dr. Colin Campbell, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ted, Dr. Barnett.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've been at it for quite a while, and it's a delight to be back speaking with you and your group. As Dr. Barnett said, I've been at this for a long time, and one of the things that really has come through to me as I've gone along is this question here. Why is nutrition not taught or respected, in fact, in the medical system? I got some ideas I want to share them here with you. Let me start up first and tell you a few comments on just what that word medicine means. And I'm telling you right up front, this is really key for me. Medicine is a concept that I refer to as reductionism. Other people do too. Looking at one thing at a time, if you will. And it's different from nutrition. Nutrition is holism. And this is not well known or discussed, I must say. But basically, nutrition for me is a whole lot of nutrients working together, eat food, they all work together in magical ways to do a lot of magical things almost simultaneously. The idea of reductionism, as I said a moment ago, is talking about one disease at a time, one cause, one mechanism, and that's key. And I say that's a huge problem. It gives us a lot of definition and certainty for some, I guess, but that's not a very good idea. So springing from that concept of reductionism is the idea that, doing one thing at a time, we have a disease, we have a problem, we want to treat it. And so we treat it conventionally with drugs, which are targeted. And of course, we all know that targeted drugs have a lot of side effects. There's no drugs that don't. And that's an issue because that's about the third leading cause of death in this country, to be honest about it, when you're counting that and then the work that goes with it. So this is why nutrition in a shorthand is not taught in medical schools, because medical schools are reductionists, nutritionists, holists. They're distinctly really different concepts. And if we were to teach nutrition the way I like to talk about it, we're taught as a holistic concept, lots of nutrients working together to create a lot of response, then there would be less need for drugs. And also, this is why the public is so confused about nutrition, because in my field, nutrition, we do the same. We have the same problem. We talk about one thing at a time, one nutrient, maybe one analog of nutrient, one mechanism for nutrient, so forth and so on. That's a different recipe for huge amounts of information and disinformation. Holistic nutrition, on the other hand, I'm mentioning here, is multiple nutrients, multiple mechanisms per nutrient. Each nutrient, has a lot of mechanisms oftentimes that treats a whole array or spectrum of diseases and other health improvements. And the words I like to describe this is whole food, plant-based. I was challenged with this idea way back in the late 70s one time when I was on the National Cancer Institute committee determining who gets funded and who doesn't. And they were all cancer researchers, and they asked me that we saw a couple of applications come in that mentioned nutrition. They wanted me to take some time and explain what nutrition was. That was kind of crazy to expect that, but I came up with words that best described what the evidence that I was seeing. That was plant-based. And then I added the word whole 3 or 4 years later. That's another story talking about whether we use them alone or use the whole food. But in any case, let me go back a little bit. This some people have probably seen this too much, but I have to put in there because it's germane to the ideas that I eventually came up with. I was raised on a farm, milking cows, a long time ago. There was on a combine cutting grain so I could go to school, go to college. And then when I went to school, I eventually did my doctorate dissertation of all things on a project encouraging animal protein consumption. That's what we do on the farm. We're milking cows. We're, producing meat, milk, and eggs, if you will. But then after that, my first professional position, university position, was at Virginia Tech, and the man there who hired me was heading up a project in the Philippines, designing a project to feed malnourished children. And so I was asked to be the coordinator of that project, and that was the start of my career, and I'll tell you why in a moment. I saw something I did not expect to see. Namely, it seemed that the children, or some children, were getting liver cancer, of all things, at the age of 4. I learned this from a couple of medical colleagues of mine who were playing with golf one day. And they were saying that, and I came back and sort of looked at what data we had on that question. It seemed like there was some information that suggested that the children who were the best fed were the ones getting liver cancer. Most of them, of course, were seriously malnourished. And then I saw this paper in India to pull things together. Namely, the Indian folks working with liver cancer, once again, responding as what they called hyperplastic nodules, they decided to try changing the protein level in the diet because they thought that protein, very special, that would prevent the cancer. Here's their result. Animals fed 20% of calories as protein, animal protein, I should say, as opposed to animals fed 5%. That's marginal. That's obviously about as low as you get. So look at the results they got. In this particular study, the animals are exposed to a chemical carcinogen that causes liver cancer, a 100-0 score. Well, quite frankly, those workers didn't believe that. They went back and tried to show something different, and they thought they did. But nonetheless, this is what I saw. And my responsibility at the time was to make sure that these kids got enough protein, and we were encouraged to think about using high-quality protein, animal protein, casein in particular. So this was a challenge. Do you see this? I'm expected to do something different. So I came home and then basically organized a study with NIH and had that project repeated over a period of about 30 years. And so we really learned about this question concerning, is it possible that animal proteins can increase cancer, in this case, liver cancer? So that's what started my journey. And I'll show you here, we had a whole host of results. It's time went along those first 2 years, but I wanted to show you one key plot. We got essentially the same thing the Indian workers have gotten. And so, and this little chart here showing cancer formation in the first 12 weeks or so. Cancer starts out as a mutation. We all tend to know that. It's a mutation that causes, initiates the cancer, we like to say. And I want to show you what goes on during the first 12 weeks. First off, 20% protein, like the Indian workers have done, causes cancer. It rose pretty quickly, growing, if you can see. 5% did not. So we repeated what the Indian workers had done, and they never believed what they did. Eventually went to India and gave a lecture on this, and we compared notes, but nonetheless, 20% protein turned on the cancer, and it was dramatic. Then I tried something else. I tried this. This is probably the most significant things I think I ever did. I wanted to see what would happen if we changed the level of protein in the diet. As you can see here, feeding them 20% first off, the first 3 weeks, the cancer is growing. Switch it to 5%, turn it off, then back on and off. And this showed us a couple of things. First off, it showed that cancer, although started with genes, that's a general assumption, we could actually modify the expression of those genes to produce these different kinds of end results, different amounts of cancer, if you will. And that was really dramatic. And it also showed, too, something very general that really became a big story later on. Namely, it showed that nutrition, not genes, control cancer development. Still today, the field wants to think that cancer is a genetic disease. Sure, it starts with genes, but the control of whether or not the cancer occurs or not, and whether it grows, is a function of more or less of nutrition. So with that early results, now I'm going to show you, just jumping ahead a few years, to just add another wrinkle to that observation. Namely, one of my graduate students, here we're feeding usual 5% and 20%, and these animals all got the aflatoxin, carcinogen, if you will. There's the results after near the end of the life of the animals, about 2 years. If that isn't a difference, then I never seen a difference. In other words, animals getting 20% protein, they're the ones that had the tumor severity. Quite a few animals, the others did not. That's exactly consistent with what we saw in the beginning. I mean, this is the kind of results that has never been challenged. Animal protein, in this case, what we use, animal protein turned on that cancer, and it worked really rapidly and completely. Plant protein did not. I can jump ahead here a little bit. So what really was interesting is that in that 2-year period, the animals fed 5% animal protein, casein to be specific, they're all living. And their tumor severity is virtually nothing. The animals fed their higher levels, they all died by 100 weeks. And of course, you can see the cancer response. It was a very exciting proposition to see that sort of thing. Now, let me stop here just for a second and just tell you something about the consumption of protein in a practical sense. Namely, we consume food, either animal food, plant food, if I can just generalize it a little bit. And as we consume animal food, then the amount of plant food goes down. They're go back and forth. When animal food goes up, plant foods go down. And interestingly, they both do the same thing. So they give the same result when you tease out the effect to see how it's working. So I like to think of it this way. I think it's a generalization that is generally true if we're talking about eating food of various kinds, and not counting the makeup stuff in between, but just talking about animal meat, milk, and eggs versus vegetables and stuff like that. They just they work in opposite ways, but they produce the same results as they do that. They do it together. Now, I showed you so far what casein does. That's the main protein in cow's milk. And then soy protein and wheat protein, we tried that a little later. It does not do it even when it's fed at 20%. These results I'm showing you here is just a tip of a rather large amount of information, but I think you would agree that just this information alone shows that casein is about as strong of a carcinogen as you could possibly imagine. Casein and it turns out other animal proteins as well. So animal proteins, of course, cause cancer, also causes other diseases like heart disease. It's the main effector of heart disease, and quite frankly, diabetes, setting it up, and chronic kidney disease, and a whole host of others, so-called chronic degenerative diseases in particular. Plant proteins prevent. I mean, this rather simple, a lot more data than I showed here, but this rather simple approach to understanding what nutrition can do shows us that the animal food is really pretty horrendous. I mean, it really turns on things like cancer quickly, and it does it within days. And then you can turn it on and turn it off. I've never since seen effects that are so dramatic and so completely complete and whole as this. So with that kind of information, I'm obviously getting myself into some trouble with my colleagues because no one had really shown that animal protein actually did that kind of work. And so in those days, I was more into the pharmacological discipline than the nutritional discipline. And when one sees this, causing cancer by nutrient like that, we want to know what the biochemical mechanism is. So we spent about, 15 years or so, with quite a number of graduate students I had, trying to determine what's the mechanism of this effect. Because to believe this striking effect, unusual effect, to see it, usually requires showing the mechanism by which it works. Because if we can learn the mechanism, the biochemical mechanism I'm speaking, if we can understand that, then we're in a position maybe to make a drug, like statins for heart disease, for example. So in this case, I'm looking for the mechanism. As I said, that I kept doing that over a period of some years. And I'm going to summarize here really quickly about 15 years worth of work with several graduate students doing their doctoral dissertations, quite frankly, for the most part. Here I have a duplicate set of sort of schemes showing cancer development. You can see it starts out with initiation. That's when the mutation is forming. And then the cells go through it. Once that starts, they start dividing. That's promotion. Now we're getting a tumor finally. And finally gets to this stage, this late stage. And we notice it best in humans where the cancer has migrated or metastasized to another tissue. That we call progression. So that's a serious stage, obviously, we all know. So I wanted to know what the mechanism was. And as I say, this was a lot of work, just a brief summary. But we looked at, for example, in the first instance, to see what effect high protein diet did, what effect it had on the aflatoxin, that's the carcinogen, the rate at which it gets into the cell. Sure enough, the high protein diet increased the rate it got into the cell. And then when these carcinogens go into cells, they're metabolized by an enzyme called mixed function oxidase, usually to detoxify them and get rid of them. But a little bit of stuff in that process forms, a little bit of very reactive compound forms. It's called electrophilic, extraordinarily reactive. And so we found out that the animal protein increased the enzyme, and in so doing, it increased the production of that really serious intermediate just by increasing the enzyme. Then that would increase mutations. We also changed the structure of the enzyme, did the same thing. And then we found that the high protein diet increased the binding of the carcinogen to the DNA. And then last but not least, in this particular first stage, we looked to see what effect it had on a process called DNA repair. We all got DNA repair. It works all the time. We're exposed to nasty stuff, and from time to time, we might be susceptible to getting mutations, and we got that repair mechanism that takes care of it. It disrupts it. Here's what happened. The high animal protein diet actually decreased the one good thing we have. So here's 4 different mechanisms, any one of which could be that mechanism I'm looking for. And then there's one here that turns it off. So there's 5 to start with. Which one is the mechanism? Well, we went down and then went to the second stage, promotion. We saw much the same thing. At that stage, when cancer forming our bodies, our immune system comes into play, it does things like producing natural killer cell activity, we call them T cells generally these days. And what we found here was that the high protein diet actually decreased the one mechanism that protects us, just like the DNA repair, and increased a bunch of others. It increased oxygen-free radicals and the rate at which cells divide and all of that. Finally, we got to this point here. I can summarize it. This is just the first 10. It increased the activity of 8 mechanism and decreased 2. So what did that mean? That looks a bit confusing. I mean, which one is really possibly useful for making a drug? All 10 increased cancer in unison. This was really a spectacular thing that I finally came to realize after some years, and this is true for other nutrients and other diseases and many conditions, that our body is, this is what nutrition does. when we eat whole food, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. It tends to work in concert, in unison, when we eat the right food. It's not one thing. And that's exactly what is the backbone, almost I would say, of the medical practice, or the practice of medicine itself, is that we tend to think of one thing. That's not right, with all the side effects. If one is using nutrition, use the right kind of food, we get a whole lot of things all working together and producing marvelous results. So I wasn't able to decide which is the mechanism, and therefore there's no drug, if you will. And of course, this also suggests, with this kind of evidence here, that will never be shown to be the reverse, I'm sure. But this kind of evidence here shows that, for one bit of summary, is that animal protein increases, the increase in animal protein by, the increase in cancer by animal protein is biologically plausible. That's a concept that we tend to work with in these circles, and in nutrition in general, especially. If we see something really strange, like animal protein turning on cancer, as I said before, we want to know how it works. Is it biologically plausible? So that's what we're demonstrating in this case here. It changed the whole tenor of my research in many different ways. Now I want to show you another concept of this idea of animal protein turning on cancer. Keep in mind that as animal protein goes up, plant protein goes down, or animal foods go up and plant foods go down. So it creates just one kind of response. Now, I went back not too many years ago and gathered up some data that were published by colleagues of mine and others who were looking, not being aware of this concept, who were looking at relationships between the intake of various and sundry foods or nutrients, if you will, versus various kinds of cancers. Here's one. This is probably one of the best one back in 1975. Sir Richard Dahl worked with us on the China study eventually. But in any case, here's a relationship showing in a correlation study, the observational study for different countries. When we compare for these different countries, animal protein intake versus the amount of, in this case, renal cancer, kidney cancer, what we see is all these countries are all lined up like that. I drew the regression line for best fit opportunity. What it shows is, as soon as we start eating animal protein in all these different countries in different ways, as soon as animal protein is introduced to the diet, then the risk for getting kidney cancer goes up. There's a straight line relationship. Here's a different reporter. This is 1959, actually. Someone I knew as well. This shows the relationship of animal protein intake, and that's on the bottom axis, if you will. These are screenshots, so I didn't monkey around with these things. I just drew the line. But as animal protein goes up, heart disease mortality goes up. And again, just like a straight line relationship. Now, notice these two lines here. There's one theoretically that it's suggesting. It's suggesting that as soon as countries or people in those countries start consuming animal protein-based diets, at going up, plant protein going down, if you will, as soon as they start consuming animal proteins like a toxin, it starts turning on, elevating the risk of these diseases. In this case, renal cancer, in this case, heart disease. Here's one for prostate cancer that was done in the early 1980s. And in this case, the thought in mind was, from part of all researchers at that time, was, one thing causing something, if you will. They were interested in looking at the relationship between non-fat milk, which means there's no sugar, essentially, and no fat, obviously. It's almost like a protein drink, animal protein drink. And so these are all different countries. As soon as they increase the consumption of non-fat milk, a protein drink, I'm going to say, as soon as that happened, the risk of prostate cancer went up. Again, a dramatic effect. I mean, one can hardly doubt something like this. And again, it's starting right through the XY origin and coming straight up like that. So now we've got three plots here showing more or less the same thing: kidney cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease. Here's one from breast cancer. It's a friend of mine from Canada, actually. We worked off and on together. He was looking at the relationship between breast cancer and diet, and he too was not particularly aware of the protein phenomenon He looked at saturated fat and unsaturated fat. Well, saturated fat is mostly in animal food, as you know. So he looked at the relationship between saturated fat, or if we roll it a surrogate for animal protein, the correlation is about 0.95, by the way. This is just a representation of animal protein intake versus breast cancer. So here we got kidney cancer, heart disease, prostate cancer, breast cancer. Okay, here's another one. In this case here, we got heart disease again, but in this particular case, we're looking at another nutrient called cholesterol. And that's what really, for the most several decades now, we believed was a principal cause of heart disease. It's not. Unfortunately that we've been misled on that one during the years. Animal protein is the one that really does the work, biochemically speaking. But cholesterol intake is the same thing essentially as protein intake. They're correlated. And we see the same thing again as we saw before. As cholesterol intake goes up, heart disease risk goes up for these different countries. And then here's one for colon cancer. Make no mistake about it, in this case, it's meat consumption and colon cancer risk. Once again, all of these, really the main actor here is the animal protein that tends to drive the total dietary change. So here we see a relationship, once again, really impressive. As soon as we start consuming that kind of consuming meat, the risk of colon cancer starts going up. Here's one for uterine cancer. In this case, it was total fat, which is representation, once again, of animal food. So as soon as we start increasing the consumption of animal food, uterine cancer is going up, as you can see. Now, and so there's a lot of things that I've shown you are really surrogates of animal protein intake, like cholesterol, meat, total fat. And I gathered all these slides up, as I say, maybe it was 10 years or so ago now, and recognizing that they all have protein, animal protein. And the other things that are there are really not terribly much involved, if at all. But one of my colleagues wanted to see what let's say that a diet had on breast cancer. He's the one I showed before with as saturated fat intake went up, you get more breast cancer. In this case here, he plotted polyunsaturated fats, which have come from plants, so it's plant protein essentially. It's equivalent to plant protein. And you can see as plant food goes up, there's no effect on breast cancer. That's just a scatter. This is a different scale, so in reality, there's virtually no breast cancer, or very little breast cancer when people are consuming that sort of thing. Now I just threw a couple more in here. They're just popping up to you look into the literature. Here's one for kidney stones, animal protein intake, and this is a screenshot again of some researchers in England. As animal protein goes up, kidney stones go up quite dramatically, as you can see. Here's one for hip fractures. They use the calcium here, but there's another researcher, I didn't find a slide on for this presentation, but calcium and animal protein really go together in the form of milk, if you will. So as we increase the consumption of milk in different countries, we increase the risk for hip fracture. So here's a bunch of slides, bunch of different diseases, all responding the same way. So now I want to bring you up to date here on something new, recent, if you will, the coronavirus. At the time the coronavirus was announced in 2020, we had done our China study some 10, 15 years before and had a lot of data. And I wanted to go back because we had studied a virus in China. And there was a virus called hepatitis B virus. It's a principal cause of liver cancer. This virus is the third leading cause of cancer deaths in the world. It's a really serious virus. It's much more serious than the coronavirus, to be honest about it. So we, in 1989, the second time we did our study in China, involved 8,900 adults, and we collected a lot of information, including information on the virus, the active form of the virus, and its more deadly form, as well as a lot of nutrient characteristics, and so we had a lot of information. So I want to just quickly summarize for you my story that I want to tell in regards to the results that we got. Now, viruses, here I'm talking about hepatitis B virus, not the coronavirus, but they all tend to have the same mechanics, if you will. We all get infected from time to time. There's no way really to stop that, quite frankly. very little way. So the virus comes in various sundry viruses by the thousands actually come and land on us. They're an active virus at that point. We call it antigen. So we measured the antigen in 8,900 people. This is back in the late 1980s. We measured the antigen of that virus, and then just in this little scheme I'm showing you, that virus causes liver cancer, okay? If it stays active. And sure enough, here's what happened. People consuming a small amount of animal food, animal protein, if you like, small amount, only 10% the amount we do here in the West. They were the ones, the ones who had the active virus and they're consuming animal food, as I say, a very small amount. We see anything, but we did. The ones consuming animal food, they're the ones who got liver cancer and died. Plant food, once consuming plant food, quite frankly, they formed antibodies. Their immune system functioned when they're consuming plant food. It didn't happen with the animal food, just the plant food. So the plant food basically is forming antibodies, and something else that we had measured in the laboratory some 10, 15 years before that, the natural killer cells of T cells, which now is millions of dollars being spent to see what it might do for coronavirus. But in any case, plant foods operate by different mechanisms to inactivate the virus. Well, I should tell you, this went on. It wasn't a very popular idea. I gathered the data together. It was some of the best data I've ever had. I only used the correlations that were significant, the highly significant level of 0.001. We had 11 risk factor correlations, all converging to get the same outcome. In other words, we had 11 risk factor correlation, 11 risk factors equivalent to animal plant protein intake. And what it did, it allowed people then to become immune. The immune system working well. And they did not get the liver cancer. Very dramatic, really, really dramatic, especially when it's so highly significant as that. But when I sent it into a couple of journals, I published in both before, the leading journals like Nature and Mindset, and they wouldn't even review it. This really struck me. I mean, it's the first time in my life I've ever seen anything like that. As researchers, we're entitled to send in manuscripts and then have reviewers review to see whether or not they're acceptable or not. They wouldn't even let the scientists see it. They wouldn't let our results be shown. I'm sure what was happening here was I was suggesting that this was a possibility in 2020 to us take seriously the idea of eating plants. We might not have gotten anybody getting the coronavirus consequences. Eventually, I did get a group in Europe, the European Union, a journal there, to publish it, and that was the title. I was suggesting that this evidence that we had suggested a way to get around the coronavirus. And I think that happened because the medical commissioner for Europe, is a man I've gotten to know. He likes what I do. He was with the European Union at the time, and I'm sure he had something to do with getting it published. But then it kind of disappeared for strange reasons. It was hard for my colleagues to see it. In other words, there's something going on behind the scenes to block this kind of information, pure and simple. I've seen it too many times. I should also say that too, when the vaccine came out, I know this is very controversial, but I don't particularly care because it was that whole story is so corrupted. When the vaccine it came out, neither my wife or I got the vaccine. We're in our 80s at that time, and we got infected a little while later, but nothing really happened. We were feeling a little bit, like flu-like for 6 or 7 days, and that was it. Let me turn your attention now to something else. This is one of the things that really get me cranked up about this whole plant-based diet. I'm saying that the high-quality protein is a falsehood. High-quality protein, that was coined in 1924. I know this research fairly well. And it was nothing more than sort of estimating under experimental conditions the quantity of protein being consumed that was actually retained. So it's a simple ratio, really. Animal protein, higher amounts of the protein is retained in the body. Plant protein is not. And that's what that high quality means. It does mean nothing more than that. But it's had a huge effect on public thinking over the years. the animal protein maybe is the only really good protein. It's nonsense. It's the bad protein. Plant proteins are the ones that promote disease, promote health. The animal proteins, I just showed you by a bunch of data there, and many different other ways. Animal protein-based diets, not just because of the animal protein, but because, as I say, when you consume more animal protein, you're consuming less plant protein, and that's what's contributing to it too. In any case, we did work on that question of high quality. My doctoral dissertation actually was on feeding animal protein. Supposedly, I believed, and everybody else believed it was good at the time. And so from that point onwards, I ran into this snowball effect of all these effects. That high quality protein is not high quality, because here's something else it does, and this is some data we got, at least here in the top. When we consume animal protein, it increases the amount of growth hormone, which in turn relates to breast cancer, among other problems. It increases, that's the insulin-like growth factor. It increases blood estrogen, which is associated with breast cancer and other especially reproductive cancers in women. High animal protein, or so-called high-quality animal protein, increase the production of free radicals. We did that research, and I did it with a colleague on the West Coast, and it increases mutations and it decreases that. You can see all of that here. All these things that I don't think any of us would want to have that kind of thing. They all work together to increase cancer. And that's why we see when we consume more animal protein, we get more cancer, period. It's just really straightforward. Also, animal protein is responsible for, this is a bit of history, I must tell you, and I don't have time to get into it, but the real cause of heart disease is consuming animal-based foods, and particularly it's the animal protein itself, which increases serum cholesterol, as well as the so-called LDL cholesterol, which in turn relates to heart disease. This has been known since more than 100 years, but has been largely ignored. People talk about saturated fat causing heart disease or cholesterol F causing. That's really nonsense. It's the animal protein-based diet, and therefore the lesser consumption of plant foods. And also, in strange sorts of ways, the animal protein increases blood sugar and A1C, which is an indicator of diabetes. So when we're consuming a diet that's got animal food in it, these are some of the consequences. These are some of the biochemical mechanisms that we see, to kind of prove the point. And so all of a sudden, some years ago now for me, but I really got onto this idea of high quality animal protein. There is no such thing. The highest quality protein is plant protein, and we have no need for consuming high quality animal protein. It only causes mischief. Now, just to sort of flesh that idea out a little bit more, I want to show you too what kind of nutrients we find in plant and animal foods. And it's just a very brief sort of sketch, a block here, if you will. Here's some groups of nutrients, and here's the plant and animal food, how much they have. You can see the antioxidants and complex carbohydrates, vitamins. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff. I would tell you at least in the thousands of different kind of relates. We just have a few names for them, but these kind of substances here are only made in plants. Okay, this is all good stuff. I'm sure that those of you who are listening here, you'll recognize that we got lots of claims about these one-on-one kind of thing, but it's one kind of food that has these, and there's none virtually in the animal, unless the animal ate some plants, maybe in some particular cases, like chickens especially, they might get a little bit, but that's almost none. In contrast, the plants generally have less fat. Now, some like legumes and some has more, but it's a different kind of fat. That works wonders when it's in the whole food. If we take it out and stick it into jars, it's entirely a different story. So plants are lower in protein and fat. Animal foods are higher in those two substances. And the kind of fat, the kind of protein in the presence of the whole food are very different. So once again, we don't need to, this is sort of proof that there's a difference between plant and animal foods. The difference is huge, absolutely huge. Processed foods are varied, as we all know, usually loaded up with sugar, salt, and oil, if you will, and all that sort of thing. If anything, they're worse, even if they're plant foods. When we take plant foods, cut them all up and take the oil out and take some salt and stuff, we produce these so-called processed foods, and they're not good. Now, let me show you this model of medicine that I was talking about that we're using in the West. I say it's wrong. I've really come to a point of view right now that our medical system, which is focused on thinking of one thing at a time, one disease, that's the backbone of the way we practice medicine in this country. I've spoken at many medical schools across the country, and I'm quite confident what I'm saying on this particular point, even though people get a little bit irritated with me. But in any case, we don't use nutrition. It's not taught in medical schools, because if it were taught, we wouldn't have a need for drugs. Instead, look at this. Look here. This is the amount of pharmaceuticals, dollars per capita, if you will, for different countries. We're number one in the world. We use the most pharmaceuticals any country in the world. Most pharmaceuticals per capita. That's one thing we do. We suffer the consequences. Third leading cause of death. We're the only country. There's a second one, New Zealand, that has been true, but I have spoken to people in New Zealand who say they have on the legislature now to stop doing it. But we're the only country who advertise on TV prescription drugs. On top of it, between 70 and 75% of the advertising of our TV is paid for by drug companies. It's an enormous issue that the public needs to know. We're selling drugs more than we are even almost all arms, and yet to solve our illnesses, we use it as a strange sort of argument or analysis that this is the way we're going to stay well. We just need to have a lot of drugs. It's nonsense. We just need to eat well. Okay. Okay, here's another plot that I think many of you will not have seen that I find kind of interesting. This is published by the OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, European countries especially, but others too. In any case, what this shows here is the life expectancy. Here's where the US is. These are all the virtual Western countries. We're about in last place now in terms of life expectancy. It doesn't look good. So just very simply, just the simplest possible way, we choose not to talk about nutrition. We don't understand it, even my own community are largely caught in the same bind too. But we don't pay attention to what nutrition can do. We don't know it. And so we eat the wrong food. And so we get all kinds of diseases. And then we just figure we're going to solve the problem near the end of our life by taking drugs. It's really, I have to say, it's just a total nonsense. Someday, I think we'll waking up about it, I hope sooner than later. Now, one more consequence of this kind of nutrition I would suggest we're thinking. Now we know and have known, actually we've known this for a long time, but in the last maybe 8, 10, 12 years or so, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the role of environmental issues in our livelihood. And each environmental issue sometimes is thought to have a cause, if you will. We also have the issue concerning human health. We suffer a lot of diseases. You could just see shortened lives, more deaths, and healthcare costs are through the roof, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the typical Western models I'm sure you appreciate. Here's environment. What I'm trying to show here, in the interest of time, I'm skipping going too fast through this, but what I'm really showing is that when we think about all these problems, let's say we can divide them up. I divide them up into environmental problems and human health problems, and I just picked out 6 particularly typical environmental problems, if you will. I'm sure you could add more, but just to illustrate the point, we got deforestation is an issue, deep water loss is an issue, climate warming, so forth and so on. And similarly, over in the health sector, we've got problems here too. Healthcare costs going through the roof. We use drugs and we die from drugs. We have high disease mortality, shorter life, and unequal health services. There's I guess 6 subtopics of environmental issues. Here's 6 subtopics of human health. Here's what we do. We unknowingly do this, unfortunately. When we see a problem, it gets defined somehow, like soil loss or something like that, then we focus on that, just working on it all by itself, unaware of something. It turns out that we tend to think of each of these issues having their own causes, and we get research, do research, and it supports, researchers in their work and stuff like that. We study some of these things to death almost in great detail, as if they all have independent causes. No, doesn't work out quite that way. I'm suggesting one comprehensive cause could really go a long way to solve all these problems, at least 60, 70, 80%, and do it really rather quickly. It's amazing. And that one comprehensive cause, as you might imagine, is for us to eat the right food. It behooves us, as a society, especially as professionals, to actually share this information for the public. This is something the public doesn't know really all that well, because for one thing, the television is controlled by money from the benefactors of us spending all the money. So this is kind of a holistic kind of idea. Just do one thing: quit raising cattle for slaughter or animals. There's no need for so many animals. Zero. And for me, this has been quite a journey, because that's why I showed you I was raised on a farm. I was a hunter. I was a fisherman. I even trapped fur-bearing animals, for God's sake. That's what we did in those days. And I milked cows. And so I was the first one to go away from home to go to college. My dad only had 2 years of elementary school education. And he was anxious for me to get it. I was the oldest son, and wanted for me to get an education that he did not have. And so for 5 years, drove into junior, senior high school, 102 miles a day just to go to school. And so I'd like to say that just in his behest, because I got the education for whatever. I just got into stuff here and had to face a lot of propositions that I myself did not believe in the beginning, but I've come to believe. And now I'm really enthusiastic, and I'm trying to spread the word. We've got a lot more information we can act on now to create a better life for all of us. The book that I sort of just started to tell this in, I reluctantly wrote this book, and that's another whole story because of the difficulties I was getting in my profession, telling such nonsense. But I wrote the book, The China Study, and did not expect to sell much, or because we don't usually do that in science, not books for the public. I was told by publishers that we met with, take all those references, that we had like 750 references. I wanted to make a book that was scientifically valid, at the same time readable. And I wrote it and co-authored with my son, who's now at the University of Rochester as a medical man, with his wife also in medicine. We're now going forward with doing some of this kind of research. But enough stuff on the side. The China study came out in 2005 first. I didn't know it was going very far, but actually it's now been translated in at least 50 foreign languages, and it says 3 million copies. There's an old slide. I'm sure it's over 4 and probably close to 5, because it's just continued to keep on going. A second book concerns my attempt to describe how does it work. And I'm arguing that it's a holistic phenomenon, everything working together. So that's what this book is about. And then the third one just came out in 2020, written with my grandson, who's a writer, on the future of nutrition. And I'm trying to describe there, from history. How did we get on such a wrong track? What's the future going to be like? And so I would argue that we need to first learn about the history. Why we got ourselves in such a rut. And I may put a plug here for Dr. Barnett. Dr. Barnett and a few others have actually somehow taken a course a little bit out of the mainstream of medicine. I applaud that. Because they're working toward the idea that nutrition maybe is just important, among other things that we could do. And so that for me is the recipe for future nutrition, something like what Ted and others are doing. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't go through too fastly. I got caught up in my stuff, and I get too excited about talking about it. But it's hard to write about so much information, and hit on the high points. But I hope I have challenged you for your thinking that what we choose to eat really makes a world of difference, not just for us ourselves, but for, they say, animals as well. We don't need to kill them to eat them. We don't need to raise them. And it has all kinds of other benefits. We need to change our attitude in a major, major way and get on with it. Thank you.
Again, I'm going to thank Dr. T. Colin Campbell, and I'm going to welcome Dr. Susan Friedman to the stage, please. And Dr. Friedman has been working with me for quite a long time, since I think about 2015 with Rochester Lifestyle Medicine Institute. And she is a professor at the University of Rochester, lead author on the white paper on healthy aging from the American Geriatric Society, and very well published in a number of other areas. So Dr. Friedman is going to help us manage questions. So what's our first question, Dr. Friedman?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say that there are many, many notes in the chat saying thank you, both for your presentation and for your body of work, which has been just so incredibly impactful. And yeah, we all owe you a debt of gratitude. So
I second that.
So the first question is, are there any studies showing the occurrence of cancer, strokes, and heart disease in people on keto diets and other diets that are high in protein?
Yes, there are. There are some, and not as robust, maybe, and as plentiful as what they otherwise are, but nonetheless, quite a number, and they're all in the same point. The keto diet does not promote health, like I'm talking about. It just simply doesn't. It's loaded with animal protein to start, so it's not surprising.
Thank you for that. There's a question or a comment about having plant-based protein versus animal-based protein in midlife, and the impact on both cardiovascular health and brain health over time. And I guess I would turn that into a question, which is, do you feel like there's obviously it would be great if people could eat a whole food plant-based diet throughout their life, but are there any particular times in life where you think it's particularly important, or is any time a good time?
Well, I think the best answer is starting kids out right from the get-go, in this kind of food, because that becomes their lifestyle and their diet, and so they become accustomed to it. We've got loving grandchildren, and they're all eating that way, and most of our children had the benefit of that too, at least in their teenage years. I don't know. I think that it works almost any time of the life. My one son's had some film, Plant Pure Nation and Food for Freedom. He just won a lot of awards, where he's got a group of people, and I think Dr. Barnett has done obviously the same kind of thing. But in any case, just seeing that within a week or so, you see dramatic effects almost all across the board, and at different ages. At different ages, my youngest son here at Rochester showed me 2 papers they just published today, just looking at what it really has with respect to diabetes, for example, and looking at different ways. And there's one thing I think is important to point out. It takes a while to get used to this. And so when people do these 9-day, 10-day jump starts, if you will, we call them, I'm sure that, as I say, Dr. Barnett has done the same kind of thing and seen this. Some people actually switch. These are people who have problems. They switch. They become accustomed to it, but only about 10%, to be honest about it, stay with. I have some good friends in Italy who also are aware of this, see this kind of thing. What they learned is really kind of neat. You got a bunch of people together, fed them for 9 days, and then they asked them, would you like to do another 15 days? They did that 4 times. And finally, by that time, 100% of the people were there.
Mm.
What a point that was demonstrated was that when our body becomes accustomed to this, the taste and so forth, it seems to work.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, ours is a 15-day jumpstart, and the reason we chose 15 days is because it begins and ends on the same day of the week. So we first started doing 3 Saturdays, right? Back when we did it in our office, and then of course the pandemic came along, and we had to pivot to using Zoom, which is really fantastic, actually. It allows us to reach many more people. We've reached 2,200 people now and we run the program every month. But yeah, it's fascinating that you say that people who do it 4 times become 100% converters. We do allow people to take the Jumpstart for free the second time, but maybe we'll have to look at encouraging people to do it even more than that. Because humans are social animals. They really like to.
Sure.
They just right. And that's what's so interesting about it. We got to make it social. If I could just repeat one of the things that you were talking about, though, you were talking about how a number of things really just are proxies for animal protein.
Right.
So right. So can you just go through that again? What you mean by that?
Yeah, protein, by the way, the name protein
Right.
was coined in 1843.
Right.
Actually, I have to tell you, my great grandfather.
Really?
I didn't know that. I discovered it later, yes, but he
Oh,
was a
wow.
physician. He published a bunch of books and he became a vegetarian back then.
Huh.
But in any case,
Huh.
so I didn't know that until it was my grandmother's father, actually. I got carried away with, so what'd you say? What?
No, the
Oh,
question is animal protein. There's other things that really just a
yeah.
proxy for animal protein.
So protein was named after the Greek word proteos, means of prime importance. So from the get-go, the word protein was of prime importance. And that was assumed to be only in animals for many years. Then it was discovered in plants, yeah, but that's lower quality and so forth. So that history is really interesting. So a lot of people came to believe, without knowing the science, that the only really good protein is a animal protein. And so then some people came along in the early 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, so forth. They started showing some benefits, that health benefits for people who went off of animal protein-based diets, like exercise, fitness, stuff like that, heart disease. But and they did not want to say, or they couldn't say, they weren't allowed to say that was all due to protein. So they chose some other words, like cholesterol. The cholesterol we consume is what causes high cholesterol in the blood. Sounds halfway reasonable. Or the saturated fat we consume, and so they blamed it on other things. It's a really interesting story. And we didn't really become all that aware of it, or start to get aware of it until, gosh, 1980s. I've been part of that, trying to exercise in that change of thought. So, so we end up with a lot of mythology in terms of the kind of nomenclature we use, or the description of the events that occur, and so forth. And it's just so full of that, it's almost hard to retrace our steps, unless we really get in there and look at the original data. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And all the while, animal protein is prime importance.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
You can't question it.
Right. Dr. Friedman, we have another question?
There was a question about how much protein we can process at any given meal, whether there's an upper limit, and I guess that question would apply to both animal and plant protein.
No, we can consume all the plant protein we can eat. We don't need no concern about that. The animal protein, yes, there are concerns, as I showed in those slides there, that you start eating a little bit of animal protein, risk starts to rise. Not immediately, so people don't necessarily see it. You go back and you have to look at the data. It's only raising the risk. So my take on all of that, especially having worked in exactly that field for so long and have to change my mind, it turns out that the most animal protein we should consume is zero. All kinds of reasons. And so that's why I coined the word, the concept whole food, plant-based, in part just to reflect, it was hard to come up with words somehow that wouldn't irritate everybody to death before we get started.
Right.
So,
yeah, we give you full credit for coining that term. We use it all the time. In fact, here's a question that's kind of about that. So, do you agree with Dr. Esselstyn on no plant-based oils or nuts?
Well, no, it's taken to the extreme. I know S and I are really good friends. We talked about it a lot, been on the stage together and had this conversation, but, uh, when he's advising people with disease, he'll tend to say, no oil, no this, no that, because he's concerned that if he gave them a little bit, then they're going to be taking more. So that's his point. But if you look at the science, if you really look at the science, I cannot argue that, zero fat, we can't get there really. We can talk about zero added fat, and most added
Right.
fat is unsaturated, and
Right.
it's problematic, yes. So we should just get as low as we can. And you can, again, I tell you, it's the kind of thing where you can become used to it, a low fat kind of thing. But if you put a little bit on now and again, we still do that, some salt, whatever.
Mhm.
There's
And
plenty
the
of,
role of nuts, what is your feeling about that?
yeah, I think nuts are great. I think they're really good food.
Right.
Uh, and Dr. Esselstyn, I mean, I don't, what probably want to say, we're really good friends anyhow. He puts walnuts on his cereal, so we've,
Yeah.
we've traveled and done all kinds of things together. So
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting. So our jumpstart that we run, it is based on Esselstyn's plan, but it's for the first 2 weeks. And we
okay.
find that we get people get really, really rapid results. And then we talk about transitioning and adding back in some high fat plant foods. And then it gets really interesting and really exciting. I can still remember though, this one woman who was 1 week into the jumpstart, and she said, I have a confession to make. Last night I ate a walnut. And
Oh, yeah.
I thought we've done our job. If she considers that to be a
Yeah,
forbidden
yeah,
fruit, it's great. So yeah, we had absolutely encouraged people to eat walnuts and other healthy nuts after uh, um, after they're done with the 2 weeks. Unless
yeah.
of course they're have severe heart disease and are trying to overcome that quickly. So yeah. Susan.
Yeah, so a somewhat political question, but asking about dietitians and their education. So so the question is, we have multiple dietitians in our health system, but it seems like it's pulling teeth to get them to promote whole food plant-based diets. One of the arguments is that medical schools don't teach this. Why is it that dietitians aren't more on board as a whole body?
Because they're conferences and all the literature they get is paid for by drug companies and animal food companies. I have spoken, I was the lead speaker actually for over a 3-decade period. And the last time I went, they had a registration bag that had listed on it. They were proud sponsors. Gosh, it was really crazy. They are exposed to a really heavy dose. I feel very sad, very sorry for them. A really heavy dose of advertising from the wrong food companies. And so there's a longer story here that I could tell, but I love the dietitians. They tend to be people who are really honorable, and they're just making a career and going out and want to talk to the public. And I've taught a lot of dietitians myself, but I really regret the fact that the hierarchy is not necessarily treating them as they should be treated. It's just, I'm just being honest. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Here's an interesting question. So you were talking about casein and its cancer initiation and promotion and progression. Do we know that whole dairy would have the same effect as casein? And also, do we know that other animal proteins would have the same effect as casein?
Yeah, animal proteins. Yeah, I have a friend in Canada, Ken Carroll, you might know the name, who actually looked at a series of proteins, plant and animal, and all the animal proteins, with respect to serum cholesterol for starters, and all the animal proteins are on the high side, and all the plant proteins, there's no overlap. The plant proteins have this property, whatever it is, it's a different set of amino acids to some extent, but different ratios, all that stuff. But for some reason,
Mhm.
they just sort of separate like that. Animal proteins do this and plant proteins do that. As far as milk is concerned, dairy, I drank a lot of that growing up and so forth. But the casein is a problem. If you put it into the casein, as I mentioned, if you put the casein into the typical animal bioassay for chemical carcinogens, I know that group very well. I've spoken to that group several times, and that casein is without a doubt, by far and away, in that metric, in that system, is the most potent chemical carcinogen ever identified.
Mm.
And
And would that,
I'd like to hear me say that, but I'm sorry, that's what it is.
and is that true whether or not it's in whole dairy? That's the question. They're wondering if,
Oh, yeah. I don't know that I can't really answer that question. You have to
Mhm.
use food and then I guess the whole dairy and then take out the casein as parts or stuff like
Right.
that. I tend to think, yeah, it's all working about the same, because if you look at the relationship between dairy consumption and fractures and serum cholesterol and all that sort of stuff, you see exactly the stuff you see with animal protein.
Right. And
That's not-
I guess skim milk would be basically, most of the calories would be coming from casein, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really loaded.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is just casein and lactose, I guess. It was the
We,
calories.
we, we produce our own. I turned a centrifuge by hand when I was a
Right.
kid,
Yeah.
to spin down the milk and produce
Butter.
skim milk in those days.
Right. Interesting. Dr. Friedman, we have time for a few more questions.
There's one question about sort of mechanisms that are specific to certain cancers versus mechanisms that are more generalized. And so would you say that whole food plant-based dietary pattern is sort of generally applicable to all cancers, or are there some for which you would say that it's been shown to be more effective?
That's a good question. I have to be careful how I answer this, of course, at the same time. But my son, Tom, who's here in Rochester, he just had done some work with women stage 4 breast cancer. He wasn't allowed to take away, for some of them, he wasn't allowed, even if the person wanted to do it, he wasn't allowed to take away their drugs they were using. So he's maintained that. But still, even with all those women that were on chemo, if you will, put them on whole food beds, he got some really very interesting results, all positive.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the use of the drugs for cancer is concerned, yeah, the big block is referred to as cytotoxic chemotherapy, as you know. The cytotoxic agents, are actually mutagenic themselves, and they also are cancerous. They're tough. They're tough drugs, really tough. And I want to say, and I'll say I believe this. I don't have all the data to prove this point, but people inclined to get cancer are probably best off, if they aren't already doing it, go to a whole food plant-based diet. I will tell you, my wife, when she was, what was she? She's now in her 80s. When she was in her mid-60s, she was diagnosed with advanced melanoma. That's a tough one. It advanced her lymph glands. And so she went to the exercise of seeing the doctors and stuff. We had just changed more or less at that time. And so she went back to get her orders, which meant lymphadenectomy, removing the lymph glands that were invaded, as well as, going on a regimen of chemo. Wasn't the cytotoxic type of chemo, but chemo in general. She said she wanted nothing of it. And the attending physician, I was sitting there, he didn't know me from Adam, but I saw his reaction. He was very upset with her and said if she came back in 6 months, it would be too late. I mean, she really got the pressure, and I know that happens. And so she said, I'm not doing it. Now she's in her 19th year. No evidence of a return.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is doing some cancer patients himself and getting these results. So we need more data. on the cancer. I think we all agree to that.
Mm.
But I think the chemo itself is not, from what I've seen and what I know about the biochemistry, it's
Mhm.
I can say that.
I'm gonna, do you think it has anything to do with the financial incentives behind selling these really, really expensive drugs versus getting people to eat broccoli?
How do you dare say that? I just write, I've read quite a bit about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. You know, we do have that involvement of cash on hand
Hmm.
is used to get people to do certain things they otherwise might not do, and also blocking stuff that they should do. I feel
Right,
very strongly about that. But
right. Well, it is now 8:46, and we promised we would be done after 15 minutes of Q&A. So Dr. Campbell, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time and effort you've put into your preparation for tonight, as well as your preparation throughout your entire life.
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any final words for us?
No, and you know, I just said this at the beginning, I'm really serious. I'm not saying it just for being gracious, but you have been on the right track.
Mhm.
And your wife too, Carol, you know, I have an exchange with her from time to time. She knows her legal stuff. And so we I really enjoy that interchange.
Great,
So
great. Yeah.
what you and Carol are doing just is a classic, really classic.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here. And thank you, Dr. Friedman. We really appreciate your help. And Bob, behind the scenes, our engineer for tonight. Thank you, Bob. And good night, everybody.
Thank you.
On a regular basis, run these 3 programs, 2 of which are certified by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Our own 15-day whole food plant-based jumpstart, which is based on teaching whole food plant-based nutrition, kind of along the Esselstyn style, which is a very low-fat whole food plant-based diet for those 2 weeks. And then we teach people how to then go on to a whole food plant-based diet at some other level of fat. We also are running the Lift Project from Darren Morton in Australia. And then we have our own health coaching services for people who would like individual or group health coaching. And those programs, once again, are running on an ongoing basis. We run the Jumpstart program at least once a month. In January, we did 2 overlapping sessions. And in March, we'll also be doing 2 overlapping sessions. And you can go to rochesterlifestylemedicine.org to register. And then really appreciate everybody attending. If you'd like to take a picture of that QR code, we'd really appreciate that. We are a nonprofit, dependent almost entirely on donations. My wife, Carol, and I are full-time volunteers with the organization. However, we do pay our full-time staff a decent living wage, and there's about 7 of them and about another 7 or 8 part-time people who work with us.